Good afternoon, AP Comparative. Welcome back to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. I'm Mr. Andrew Canine, right here from the northern suburbs of Chicago in the great state of Illinois. It's getting to be spring weather here. Happy April. We're going to spare you the April Fools, and we're going to get right into the test prep, particularly test prep from Unit 1. One of my favorite topics today, we're going to be comparing democracies versus authoritarian governments, uh, which we were mentioning yesterday, come straight out of the news in terms of how governments around the planet are responding to COVID-19. Again, I'm Andrew Canine. Thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time tuning in, I would really invite you to go download the College Board course description that's available at apstudents.collegeboard.org. It's really going to help you follow the codes that I'm using. We're really focusing here on units 1, 2, and 3. We had some review lessons looking at the policies of unit 5 last week, but really drilling down into units 1, 2, and 3. And it's super helpful if you can go into that course description and you can see that in this course description, there's a lot of the key vocabulary words, some country examples, so it can be super helpful to follow along. If you'd like to see the notes that I'm using in my particular PowerPoint slides, I'd invite you to go to Dan Larson's citizenu.org, where he's been nice enough to carve out the comparative corner. And if you go in there, there's a hot link that takes you to the PDF of the notes that I'm using. So welcome back again. Thank you for tuning in. And we always start with some shout outs that you guys have tweeted out to hashtag APCompGov 2020, including Mr. Kane in Silver Spring, Maryland, welcome, and Mr. Quast. And don't forget out there in Portland, Oregon, Ms. Squires Osborne, who's taken over comparative government for the first time. So thanks for the students shouting out to Ms. Squires Osborne, and Ms. Rogers out there, a rock star in the world of comparative government, and in the Hall of Fame, in the King of Corny, and I know this man, so I'm really pleased that a student from Delaware has shouted out Mr. McCormick, who is known as the King of Corny. Thank you for the shout out, students. Always appreciated. Also, don't be shy about letting us know what snack food you're consuming during these College Board broadcasts. I'm very happy that on March the 4th, I had the vision to go to Costco, and I am not ashamed that I bought 14 bags of veggie straws. Mrs. Canine tried to make me feel guilty about that, but I'm living in the lap of luxury of veggie straws. So don't be shy about tweeting out your favorite snack food that you're consuming as you watch these College Board review shows. Also, thank you to students who are putting out country examples. It's a great way to jog your memory for the students who are going on Twitter to hashtag APCompGov 2020. Maybe they might be more familiar with some countries and maybe less familiar about other countries. So this could be a really good way of helping you to teach other students about current events and also some case examples that we're seeing for some of these core concepts. So we had examples of government change, and students were tweeting out the change from May to Boris Johnson, Theresa May to Boris Johnson just last year, or the change from Putin to Medvedev. It's the one time that Putin wasn't president, those 4 years from 2008 and 2012 in the last 20 years. And also we had examples of regime change. Remember, regime change is that enduring change in government. So when Iran's theocracy took over after the revolution in 1979, or the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that led to the creation of the Russian Constitution. And of course, some teachers really love to point out that that change from the institutional revolutionary party of Mexico that had dominated Mexican politics under a near authoritarian government that was supposed to look like a democracy, that when you had your first PAN president elected, the National Action Party, Vicente Fox was elected president in 2000, that a lot of political scientists look at that as an example of a regime change. In fact, we're going to be talking about that type of example today as we look at comparing democracies versus authoritarian governments. And then tomorrow, as we look at how countries have moved from more authoritarian characteristics into more democratic characteristics through the process known as democratization. So two of my favorite lessons, topic 1.3 and 1.4 tomorrow. We also had an example, not that Myanmar is on the exam, please do not worry if you don't know about Myanmar, but we had a student out there, very wise, tweeting out an example of a nation within a state, and she tweeted out that the Rohingya peoples of Myanmar would be that example of a nation within a state. So even though Myanmar is not an AP comparative, I know Mr. Larson's out there sweating. Did he forget to teach Myanmar as one of his core countries? No, Mr. Larson, you did not forget that, so don't worry, but it's still definitely an example of a nation within a state. So also thank you to those students, Nick and Eldar, my goodness, keep those fact checks coming. Nick caught a slight bobble in one of my multiple choice questions in a recent lesson, and Eldar got a slight misstatement about the timing of the referendum in Russia as it pertains to the constitutional changes that Putin definitely wants, that we suspect that will probably happen in Russia. We'd be shocked if it doesn't, and we'll get into that actually today. But because of coronavirus and concerns about the spread, even in countries like Russia, that referendum has been delayed. So thank you for the fact checks. It makes me feel like I'm back in the classroom, because I can promise you there'll be other facts that you can check in the remaining lessons. So yesterday I left you with an AP exam kind of preview, and we're going to use that as a warm-up today to differentiate democratic regimes from authoritarian regimes. That is today's topic. And I'm going to show you some examples later of an FRQ that I've written that really gets to the heart of the difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes. So that's something that you should be considering today. What is it that differentiates democracies from authoritarian governments? Some of the questions I've written today are questions that I've given to my students in my own class. And I like these particular questions because you're going to see that sometimes as students of political science, we stereotype that authoritarian governments don't have elections and democracies do have elections. And there's a lot of stereotypes out there that aren't necessarily true. And you really have to go a little bit deeper to understand some of the complexities of democracy versus authoritarianism. So that's what we're doing today. And of course, if you can think of some examples that are specific to a case country, we'd love to see you put that out there at our Twitter hashtag APCompGov2020. So today we are looking at lesson 1.3. We're comparing democracy with authoritarianism. We're looking at what differentiates a democratic regime from an authoritarian regime. And really, by the end of today's lesson, I want you to see a potential type of FRQ that I've written for my students that you could use to help test your skills. Are you able to describe the difference between a democracy and authoritarianism? Are you able to explain particular characteristics? So we're going to get into that today. Keep in mind that certainly we're focusing a lot on units 1, 2, and 3, because we've been told that those are the key units for the revised AP comparative exam in 2020. So even though I'm talking about topics in unit 1, please keep in mind that you're going to see these repeated also in upcoming units. In unit 2, when we talk about the structures of government, and particularly topic 3, when we talk about political participation and how democratic governments and authoritarian governments treat participation differently. So we're going to give you a taste of that today, but much more of an entree in later units. We are going now sequentially through unit 1, and then after unit 1, I'll go sequentially through unit 2 and unit 3. We'll still do a little bit of taste of unit 4 and unit 5 before we end on May the 1st. And we'll try to connect this to a lot of different units like I just spoke about, and a lot of practice questions, multiple choice, and FRQs. If you ever have a question about those FRQ or FRQ skills, don't hesitate to ask through Twitter. I'm trying to talk through some of those skills. I'm trying to model what I think are really good and complete answers. But if you have a question, or if you want to put, I guess, a sample of your own writing on Twitter, you could put it out there for the community to look at. And if I have a chance, maybe I'll give you some feedback. So we are going right into lesson 1.3 on contrasting democracy with authoritarianism. I start off all these lessons by looking at the core concepts that are highlighted in the course description. This is not my set of vocab words. These are actual vocab words that are listed in the course description. So we know that the different FRQs, the 4 different types of FRQs, are very much focused on core concepts and vocab. So I really emphasize this with my students to understand the key vocabulary of the course. And the nice part about that course description, as you can see from this list from 1.3, you actually see a list of vocab that's listed in each unit, in each topic of the course description. And in many cases, the course description actually gives you a very complete description, albeit a definition of some of these words. So anytime I have a definition or description that pretty much comes, or in these cases comes word from the course description, I put an asterisk there to let you know that this comes straight from the course description. So we're looking at the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. The topic I'm going to talk a lot about today is rule of law. I've mentioned a little bit in previous lessons about governmental transparency, because that can certainly be a trait of democracies. We're going to talk about what a free and fair election means. These are words that we tend to throw out a lot, that we say free and fair, but how do we actually describe that? Can it be measured? We're going to talk about what it means to be an independent branch, maybe an independent legislature or independent judiciary, and why that's important to distinguish democracies from authoritarian governments. I'm going to get a little bit into these terms: illiberal democracy, and a synonym for illiberal democracy, hybrid regime, that's sometimes used to describe a country like Russia that isn't as authoritarian as Iran or China, but certainly has the traits of an authoritarian government. And we'll talk about one-party states as it relates to China, and theocracies, totalitarian governments, and military regimes. So those are the key vocab. Now, going a little bit more in depth on those key vocab, I've created some charts here that I present to my students that help to kind of categorize some examples. This is by no means an extended list of descriptions for each of these countries, but just to give an idea, a snapshot, if you will, of why we tend to look at some countries as being more democratic and other countries as being more authoritarian. And one of those traits is certainly this adherence to what we call the rule of law, or as Disraeli said, with words we govern, right? So in a democracy, the laws are supposed to matter, because when we don't have that authority figure there, and authority figure could be a police officer in either a democratic country or an authoritarian government, but when there's that law enforcement officer is not there, why do we stop at that stop sign in the middle of the night when we're pretty sure we're not going to get a ticket? And there's a lot of political theory about this, a lot of political science is written about this, but in the end it comes down to, what does the law mean in a particular country? And who does that law apply to? So in the case of a democracy, we tend to say that not only does the law matter, because obviously in an authoritarian government, you have citizens who obey the law too, because they're worried about being persecuted for breaking the law. But in a democracy, we know that those laws tend to be more transparent. The way those laws are made are put through a process, in many cases a legislative process, or they're announced publicly. And we have independent courts in a democracy that make public decisions about the interpretation of those laws. And in criminal proceedings or civil proceedings, we can see a history of how those laws are applied in particular cases. So that, again, there's a transparency there and a precedence in a democracy. So in a more authoritarian government, you tend to see law that's arbitrary And you tend to see law that's pretty much more directed at opponents of the government, or people who are out of power in a government find themselves subjected to the law. Sometimes we call that rule by law in a more authoritarian government. So I put some examples in here for each of the 6 core countries of how we could describe rule of law in our more democratic governments, like particularly the United Kingdom, where we've seen the legislature, the House of Commons, vote against executive branch preferences to use the military, the British military in Syria back in 2013. We've seen the national legislature in Nigeria block attempts by a previous president back in 2006 of trying to get a 3rd term. And we've also seen in Mexico, we've seen one party's president, we've seen this a number of times in Mexico, we've seen one party's president leave office in allowing a president of a rival party to take office because of an election result. That's rule of law. The laws matter, and it allows the party or the people who are out of power to actually have some power when there's a rule of law, because in a rule of law, the law applies to all groups equally, that no one or no leader is above the law. Well, you contrast that in a more authoritarian government like China, where the laws are much more arbitrary. And so we've seen President Xi in China actually end term limits with legislative support. So they've actually changed the law to help keep President Xi and his factions, his allies in power. And certainly we've seen very forceful coercion and violent suppression of protests in Iran, particularly back in 2009, even more recently, but particularly those 2009 protests against election fraud in Iran. And then in Russia, you see examples of using military force to go into neighboring countries, specifically Ukraine, in Russia's case, and actually take over large pieces of land like Crimea, of being a more authoritarian or arbitrary decision that would not be in keeping with the rule of law. So in some cases, rule of law can actually be described a little bit easier than it can be defined. One of the other traits of democracy is, to what extent does the government control the media? We know that all 6 of our core countries have broadcast media, and they have print media as well. And we also know that in all of 6 of those countries, to some extent, there are government broadcast networks. So just the idea that the government controls a broadcast network doesn't necessarily make your government more authoritarian. So in the case of the countries that are on the left-hand side here, the more democratic countries of Mexico, Nigeria, and United Kingdom, they tend to be seen as more democratic in terms of their treatment of the media, because even though the government does run some of the broadcast media outlets, they do allow for political dissent to take place, sometimes on those broadcast channels or on different broadcast networks, where there are people who are allowed to speak, who are allowed to speak out against the government, against the people in power, in a way that exhibits the freedom of speech and those types of civil liberties. The governments on the right, China, Iran, and Russia, that demonstrate more authoritarian characteristics, again, you see a much deeper and wider control, particularly of broadcast media. So you might have some independent print and internet sources in Russia, and certainly Russia is more likely to have more of an independent media voice than, say, that's allowed in Iran, and certainly that's allowed in China. But when it comes to the broadcast networks, for the last 20 years, for most of the last 20 years, the Russian government has controlled what's broadcast, or has very much has allies who control those broadcast networks, who self-censor and rarely put, if ever, any news out there that's critical of President Putin or his political allies in how they control the government. And the voice of dissent is really not heard as that much in Russia as compared to more democratic countries. And then certainly when we get into Iran and China, you see a much greater extent of government control, particularly of broadcast media. And a term that your teacher probably used with you in China is the Great Firewall, where the Chinese technology has tremendous capability to censor what's even access to read on the internet, as an example of more a much stronger degree of authoritarianism in China. Here's that word transparency again. Transparency is about access to information. And we know that the media, we like to call in US politics, the fourth estate, and how vital a media is to be able to read the news, but also part of reading the news is the news and the press and their ability to access information, or citizens' ability to access information. And particularly if you study this course country by country, and you've studied countries like Russia and Mexico, you've seen examples where journalists have a difficulty getting that information. And particularly in Mexico's case, it's not necessarily the government harassing those journalists, but in many cases in Mexico, it's organized crime and the drug cartels that are harassing those journalists in many cases, very violent ways. And certainly we've seen examples of that violence towards journalists in Russia as well. So if you have some country-specific examples of the democratic versus the authoritarian treatment of journalists, I'd invite you to tweet those out to hashtag APCompGov 2020. And in some cases, like China, that might actually be related to whistleblowers and the news about COVID-19, particularly in Wuhan, China, and how doctors who tried to alert the authorities early on about COVID-19 were treated. So if you have some more country-specific examples of democratic or authoritarian treatment of journalists or the news media, those would be great examples to tweet out at our hashtag. Now, that concept of free and fair elections, this is a word that we use a lot, free and fair elections, but what does that mean? What does free and fair elections? Because we know that there are authoritarian governments that we study that have national elections, and they have national elections that are regularly scheduled. So just the fact that you have an election doesn't necessarily mean that you're a democratic country. Just the fact that you have a constitution or written civil liberties, protection of rights, doesn't mean that you are democratic. So just because you have an election that's regularly scheduled doesn't make it democratic. What makes a country more democratic is if those elections matter, if they're free and fair. And my typical definition of free and fair is, does that election have an outcome that would allow a party or a person who's out of power to actually win an election and take over power? Would you have that moment that we've seen in both Mexico and the United Kingdom and in Nigeria? Do you have that moment where the party that's in power loses an election and peacefully hands over power to that rival political faction because of an election result? That is a free and fair election. And you can measure that. You can measure how close elections are. You can measure, was there an unexpected outcome where the political minority or the group that's out of power actually won? So these are specific examples that we have in our core countries. With Mexico, we've seen this several times actually since the year 2000. The PRI party had been in power for 70 plus years until 2000, when a man named Vicente Fox won the presidency with the PAN party and defeated PRI. So that'd be an example of free and fair elections in Mexico. Same thing, this alternation of power in Nigeria, where you had the party out of power from Buhari, the current president of Nigeria, who defeated Goodluck Jonathan, who had been the party in power. Actually, Jonathan's party had been in power since 1999. So that was a crucial step showing that elections mattered in Nigeria. You can still have corrupt elections. And certainly you know that in Mexico and Nigeria, they have problems with corrupt elections, but you can also measure whether an election is free and fair by the outcome or how close the government acknowledges that electoral competition became. And certainly we know that there are several examples of the transfer of power because of an election in the United Kingdom. The most recent, the Labor Party to the Conservative Party, was back in 2010. China is the one country we study that has no national direct elections for government positions. They do have elections, they're at the local level. They tend to be indirect in terms of how members of the national legislature come into power, but there are no direct elections for national government office in China. Iran and Russia, though, are examples of countries that have constitutions. Those constitutions talk about holding regular elections. Both Iran and Russia do hold regular elections. Those elections directly elect the presidents in both countries. Those elections directly elect national legislatures, but they're not free and fair. And certainly we know that Putin really has never been challenged electorally in his elections, in the 4 different times he's been elected. And you could argue that Iran has had examples of competitive elections in the past, but really since 2009, Iran has not had competitive elections. It's those hardliners who control what's called the Guardian Council in Iran's government, who vet and eliminate any moderates or any form of political dissent of candidates who might get their name on the ballot. That elections are much more controlled in Iran since 2009. And so you'd see you don't see electoral competition in Iran in terms of a rival faction coming in to take over power. But both Iran and Russia still hold those elections regularly, even though they're considered to be more authoritarian. If you have examples of electoral examples of democratic or authoritarian citizen participation, please tweet those. So we know that there are protests in all these governments. We know that even China, which is the most authoritarian government that we study in AP Comparative, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of protests that take place across China. But how the government treats those protests can help distinguish China as being more authoritarian than, let's say, the government of the United Kingdom and how they treat protesters. So if you know specific examples, even if you tweet out news stories, that can be super helpful today. In terms of government branches, we like to see in an authoritarian government, political scientists like to measure that by the independence of those branches. And again, the independence, this is something that we can describe and measure, but we see some exceptions as well. So we know that Mexico and Nigeria both have some more independence in their court systems or in their legislatures, because we've seen occasions where the courts or the legislature of Nigeria have made decisions that have contradicted what the executive wants. And specifically, I go back to Nigeria and that example of the national legislature back in 2006, telling that president that no, that he could not extend his presidency into a 3rd term. You contrast that with, let's say, China, where the national legislature has allowed the Chinese president, President Xi, to extend his term beyond the 10-year limit. And essentially there is no term limit for China's president because the legislature has acquiesced to that. Certainly, you know, some of the current events about Russia, and they seem to be on the brink of major overhauls to their government that would allow Putin to become the leader extending beyond his constitutional terms in office that are supposed to expire in 2024. So we haven't seen those officially done, but we certainly have seen the Duma so far acquiesce to President Putin's desires to change this constitution, which would indicate that Russia's national legislature is not independent. If you follow the news about Brexit, particularly with how the House of Commons rejected Theresa May's proposal for Brexit back last fall, and how that led to the rise of Boris Johnson as prime minister, and how the House of Commons initially delayed Boris Johnson's plans for Brexit. Those would be examples that political scientists could use to show that, yes, the House of Commons is more independent and sometimes stands up to even what the head of government desires. And that would be a sign of democracy. We do have the course description does list types of authoritarian regimes. And so these are words that you should be familiar with. We're going to go into in a later unit what illiberal democracy and hybrid regime, which is a synonym, and why Russia is oftentimes categorized as an illiberal democracy or a hybrid regime. China is certainly our example of a one-party state. We're going to look at in a later unit, we're going to look at party systems and the difference between a one-party state like China, where only one party really has any power to rule, versus a more dominant party system where that one party seems to win the election all the time. There's a difference. So China is our one-party state where rivals are prohibited from controlling governmental power. We have theocracies like Iran that require the government to be controlled by particular religion or religious leaders. Totalitarian government would be a word that would be maybe more applicable to North Korea or to Mao Zedong's China, where the government has almost complete control over where citizens live, where they work, some basic life decisions that citizens make. You would see in a more totalitarian government. And then military regimes, this becomes a word that's actually applicable to Nigeria, because after Nigeria's independence and before this current constitution in 1999, it was not uncommon for different coups to happen in Nigeria where military governments or military leaders would take over for a short or sometimes extended period of time. And that's what we call a military regime. So that's a word that's applicable to Nigeria. Let's get into some practice questions on topic 1.3, the difference between democracy and authoritarianism. I've written 3 multiple choice questions about today's topic, and I'll show you those answers. And then I really definitely want to spend some time on the FRQ. So when Nigeria's national legislature rejected a president's attempt to allow a 3rd term in 2006, and when the House of Commons restricted a prime minister's ability to call for new elections, these would be examples of which of the following? Is it regime change? Is it governmental transparency? Or is it state control of the media? And of course, I just skipped the correct answer, which is rule of law. So this would be an example of rule of law, that laws matter, that it's not necessarily the government, military dictating how the result's going to be from government, but the laws matter. With words, we govern. Here is a chart. We're looking to compare countries. Which of the following would be an accurate pairing of governmental leadership adhering to the rule of law? I'm going to let you read through those examples on this grid. So we're looking for the 2 cells that are both true. And the answer for this would be letter D. That adhering to the rule of law, examples would be Peña Nieto in Mexico leaving office due to constitutional term limits. And we also had that moment when Vice President Goodluck Jonathan became the president of Nigeria. And that's not the death of Buhari. Buhari is still alive. He's still the president. I have the wrong president there. So no fact checking on that one. I caught the error. I will fix that. But Goodluck Jonathan did succeed to the presidency when the president died. That would be rule of law. One more multiple choice question. Which of the following depicts a common treatment of the media in an authoritarian regime? So we're looking at treatment of the media. Government regulates the internet to diminish political dissent. Government owns and controls most broadcast media. Government allows private ownership of most broadcast and print media. Government runs some broadcast outlet, but allows political dissent in some privately controlled broadcast. Or government has little restriction on political dissent. We're looking for authoritarian regimes treatment. And of course, that is letter A, that the government regulates the internet to diminish political dissent. Okay, so let's get into an FRQ. I wrote this FRQ to model it after free response question number 3. Free response question number 3 is looking at comparing countries. So those are the skills we're mostly interested here, but we're comparing countries as they apply to a particular concept. And there are some skills that I really would suggest for you as you practice your free response writing so that you can really maximize your opportunity to score points if you were to see an FRQ number 3 on this revised comparative exam in 2020. Here is your question. Read the stem, read the beginning of the question 2. So it starts here. Compare the establishment of rule of law in 2 different AP Comparative and Government Politics course countries. In your response, you should do the following. Define the rule of law. Explain how 2 different AP Comparative Government and Politics course countries adhere to the rule of law, and explain how the extent of adherence to the rule of law in each of the 2 course countries described in B affects the extent of authoritarianism in that country. So I think this, I really like this question because I think it shows just a really straightforward way of asking students about a concept. You have to compare countries in this case. And I will show you how I wrote potential answer to this to demonstrate some of the skills and some of the mechanics of the writing that would help you maximize your points if you got a question that was similar. So I have said before, whenever you get a definition, to not just write the definition, but also to try to give an example. So I've talked a lot about rule of law. You can go back and review what I said about rule of law. I've given a definition of rule of law here in terms of the concept that creates transparent laws and applies these laws in a fair and consistent manner. But then just in case that definition or description of that word was lacking, I want to put an example in there. Sometimes I can put a country-specific example, or sometimes I can put a non-country specific example. I can put a hypothetical example in here, but get in the habit of being complete and writing an example. In this case, I talked about an independent court system establishing a rule of law that doesn't necessarily go along with the preference of the ruling executive. So I put that in my definition to be complete, to help make sure I nailed the definition of rule of law to get that point. Now, letter B is worth 2 points. You got to do 2 different things. Explain how 2 different AP comparative countries adhere to the rule of law. So this is where you want country-specific examples. So I put in here an example from the United Kingdom. It adheres to the rule of law with an independent judicial system. So I'm emphasizing that the branch is independent, that does not adjust its rulings just to satisfy the prime minister and the ruling party. The courts in the United Kingdom interpret the law according to common law principles not intended to keep a certain political faction in power. So here I gave a number of different examples from the United Kingdom to explain how they adhere to the rule of law. Make sure you talk about the other country as well. In this case, I've picked China. China's courts adhere to the rule of law in a manner that keeps China's leaders in power. For example, government officials can be prosecuted for corruption, but these prosecuted officials are often part of factions that rival the president's allies for power in China. Some categorize this use of law as rule by law instead of rule of law. If you know about President Xi's presidency in China, there have been thousands, some estimates of hundreds of thousands of political officials who've been prosecuted for corruption. The government's definitely trying to tackle governmental corruption that seems to appear as rule of law, but isn't it ironic that many of those government officials in China tend to come from political factions that have rivaled President Xi? And so that some political scientists look at that as an example of using the law to keep Xi and his political allies in power. So that's the way I described adhering to rule of law, but now I got to compare. And this is where the last 2 points from this rubric come. So for letter C, explain how the establishment of rule of law in each of the 2 AP countries described in B affects the degree of authoritarianism in that country. So now I got to talk about the degree of authoritarianism. And I've picked the United Kingdom. So I'm just going to say, we know the United Kingdom is categorized as democratic. So you can just say that the United Kingdom is much less authoritarian. Here's where I'm answering the degree of authoritarian. The United Kingdom is much less authoritarian than China because when we see explain how or explain why, we want to put a word of causation in there because the UK adheres to the rule of law with an independent judicial system that does not adjust its rulings to satisfy the Prime Minister and the ruling party of Commons. This independence of the courts makes the UK less authoritarian than the courts in China. I would really encourage you to end this, if you get a question number 3 that is all about comparing countries, put in a sentence, put in a phrase that compares the 2 countries that you're writing about. I've tried to do that to start off this last part of the question too. China is more authoritarian than the UK because China's courts use the law in a manner that keeps China's leaders in power. Instead of prosecuting corruption charges in a fair manner, China's courts are more likely to prosecute officials who rival the president's allies for power in China. This use of China's courts are not independent, is viewed as more authoritarian than courts in the United Kingdom. So I've become a little bit repetitive in really comparing the United Kingdom with China in the degree of authoritarianism, and that's fine. That helps you maximize points and to really clearly get your correct information across. I love also use paragraphs. I have to really encourage it to my students. They hate the paragraph. They like to write an entire wall of text. Be confident in your writing. Make sure you have distinct portions that are talking about the one country compared to the other. And then do a second paragraph where you're emphasizing the other country. But don't forget to try to compare there. So just a real quick summary. We're looking at the words of democracy versus authoritarianism and what are the characteristics that we can use to contrast those 2 concepts. Concepts like rule of law, transparency, free and fair elections, independence of governmental branches. And College Board in the course description does list specific types of authoritarian governments like illiberal democracies, one-party states such as China, theocracies such as Iran, totalitarian governments, and then military regimes. So those are all words that you should be familiar with. We will see connections in upcoming units, particularly Unit 2, when we talk about the independence of legislature, and specifically in 2.9, it looks at the independence of judiciaries relative to other political institutions. And then in 3.7, you'll see there's more of a discussion about Russia as an illiberal democracy, or sometimes called hybrid regime, and particularly how democracies and authoritarian governments treat civil liberties and political rights in those countries. So if you have more country-specific examples of democracy and authoritarianism, make sure you tweet those examples to #APCompGov2020. I'm going to leave you off with this question that you can do to practice for tomorrow. Tomorrow we're getting into this word democratization. That's topic 1.4. And my question for you is, how can democratization be measured? Political scientists, when they're doing their research, they like to measure things. And if you were going to try to measure democratization, what would be some data that you could use to measure the extent of democratization in a particular country? It could be specific to our AP course countries or not. But if you have country-specific examples, I invite you to use that #APCompGov2020. So as always, if you know somebody who is having a hard time accessing these videos, or who might have a hard time being able to take their AP exams on a device, or doesn't have access to Wi-Fi, please have them reach out, or you can maybe reach out for them and help them out to cb.org/tech. Tomorrow is April 2nd. We're going to move on to topic 1.4, democratization. Thank you for joining us in Studio Room 2C. It's a pleasure to see you, and it's a pleasure to help you understand, to see how countries compare. Be well.